On January 14, 2018, a 17-year-old girl with the cognitive function of a 10-year-old climbed out of a window she had been planning to escape through for 2 years. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely dial 911 on a deactivated cell phone she had stolen from inside the house. When police arrived, they found 12 other siblings still inside, some of them adults in their 20s, shackled to furniture with chains and padlocks, living in their own waste, so malnourished their growth had been permanently stunted. The parents were watching television in the next room. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. The house at 160 Muir Woods Road in Paris, California looked unremarkable from the outside. Beige stucco, neat lawn, American flag hanging by the door. Neighbors would later say they rarely saw anyone come or go. Sometimes they noticed pale figures moving behind curtains. Once, someone saw children working in the yard at night, which seemed odd but not alarming enough to report. In suburban America, we are taught to respect privacy, to mind our own business, to assume the best about the families living next door. This assumption allowed David and Louise Turpin to torture their 13 children for decades. Jordan Turpin was the only reason the world ever learned what happened inside that house. She was not the oldest. She was not the strongest. But she was the one who finally found the courage to risk everything, knowing that if she failed, the punishment would be unimaginable. For 2 years, she had been secretly planning her escape, memorizing the layout of the neighborhood from glimpses through windows, practicing what she would say to police, stealing that old cell phone and hiding it where her parents would never think to look. She knew that once she left, there would be no going back. She knew her siblings might suffer because of her decision. She knew her parents had told them all their entire lives that the outside world was evil, that police would hurt them, that they were safer inside. Would you have been able to make that choice, knowing what it might cost? The 911 call Jordan made that morning is difficult to listen to. Her voice is small, uncertain, childlike, despite her age. She struggles to explain what is happening because she does not have the vocabulary for it. She has been so isolated from the world that she does not know how to describe abuse. She says her sisters are chained up. She says she is not allowed to go to school. She says there are 12 siblings. The dispatcher asks her age and she says 17, but she sounds much younger. There is a long pause when the dispatcher asks if she is safe right now, as if Jordan is trying to calculate whether she has ever been safe in her entire life. When deputies arrived at the house, they were not prepared for what they found. Police officers are trained to handle crime scenes, violence, evidence of wrongdoing. They are not trained to walk into a suburban home and find human beings who have been systematically destroyed over the course of decades. The smell hit them first. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste. Then they saw the children. Some were adults by age but looked like adolescents, their bodies so starved that puberty had never fully occurred. The youngest was 2 years old. The oldest was 29. They were scattered throughout the house in various states of distress, some chained to beds, some sitting in dark rooms, all of them pale and emaciated and staring with the hollow eyes of people who have learned not to hope for rescue. One of the officers would later say it was the most disturbing scene he had encountered in his entire career. Another said she had to step outside multiple times to compose herself. These were not children who had been neglected. These were human beings who had been methodically, deliberately, sadistically broken down over years and years of calculated cruelty. David and Louise Turpin were arrested that day. They showed no emotion. They did not resist. They did not ask about their children. Louise, a tiny woman with a childlike voice herself, seemed confused about why police were in her home. David, tall and gaunt with long greasy hair, maintained a blank expression. Both of them would later claim they were trying to protect their children, that they were religious people, that they had done nothing wrong. In their minds, the torture they inflicted was discipline. The starvation was structure. The chains were safety measures. This is what makes the Turpin case so psychologically disturbing. David and Louise were not insane in the legal sense. They were not hearing voices or experiencing delusions. They knew exactly what they were doing. They simply believed they had the right to do it. The story of how the Turpin family reached that point in Paris, California, begins decades earlier, in a different time and place when David and Louise were young, and no one could have predicted the horror they would create together. They met in their early 20s in Princeton, West Virginia. Louise was 16. David was 24. They married quickly and Louise became pregnant almost immediately. Over the next 25 years, she would give birth to 13 children, each one born into an increasingly nightmarish existence. In the beginning, neighbors and extended family members noticed nothing alarming. The Turpins moved frequently, from West Virginia to Texas to California, always staying just long enough to avoid scrutiny but not long enough for anyone to ask too many questions. They homeschooled their children, which was legal, and raised no red flags. They attended church occasionally. They'd posted photos on social media showing smiling children in matching outfits, staged family trips to Disneyland, renewal of wedding vows in Las Vegas with Elvis impersonators. To the outside world, they appeared to be a large, religious, slightly eccentric but ultimately harmless family. Behind closed doors, a different reality was unfolding. The abuse began gradually, as it often does in cases of extreme family violence. At first, it was strict rules. No talking without permission. No leaving assigned rooms. Meals at specific times with specific portions. Then the rules became more severe. No showering more than once a year. No medical care. No education beyond basic reading. Then came the punishments. Beatings for minor infractions. Starvation for perceived disobedience. Shackling to furniture for hours, then days, then weeks at a time. The children were not allowed to play. They were not allowed to laugh. They were not allowed to cry. They existed in a state of constant terror, never knowing when the next punishment would come or what would trigger it. Do you think the neighbors should have known? Do you think someone should have seen the signs? The psychological mechanisms that allowed David and Louise to torture their own children are complex and deeply disturbing. Experts who studied the case identified several factors. First, there was extreme isolation. By homeschooling and moving frequently, the Turpins ensured their children had no contact with mandatory reporters like teachers or doctors. Second, there was religious justification. David and Louise believed they were following biblical principles of discipline and parental authority, twisting scripture to rationalize their cruelty. Third, there was a folie à deux, a shared psychosis between the parents, where they reinforced each other as delusions and escalated the abuse together in ways neither might have done alone. But perhaps most chilling was the gradual normalization of horror. The abuse did not start with chains and starvation. It started with control. And once that control was established, it became easier to take the next step, and the next, and the next, until what was happening inside that house bore no resemblance to normal family life. The children did not rebel because they did not know rebellion was possible. They did not cry out because they did not know anyone would listen. They had been conditioned from birth to believe that their suffering was normal, that their parents loved them, that the outside world was more dangerous than anything happening inside their home. This is the true horror of the Turpin case. Not the physical abuse, though that was severe. Not the starvation, though that was life-threatening. The true horror was the psychological destruction, the systematic erasure of these children's sense of self, their understanding of reality, their ability to imagine a different life. Jordan Turpin broke that cycle. At 17 years old, with the mind of a child and the courage of someone much older, she decided that death was preferable to one more day in that house. She did not know if the police would believe her. She did not know if her siblings would survive without her. She did not know if she would be punished for trying. But she climbed out that window anyway, and in doing so, she saved 12 lives. The rescue of the Turpin children made international headlines. Photos of the house circulated online. Details of the abuse emerged slowly, each revelation more disturbing than the last. The children ranged in age from 2 to 29. Some of them did not know what a police officer was. Some of them had never seen a dentist. Some of them could not walk properly because they had been chained in one position for so long their muscles had atrophied. The oldest daughter, at 29 years old, weighed only 82 pounds. Several of the children had cognitive impairments from malnutrition. All of them had severe psychological trauma. When investigators searched the house, they found journals written by some of the children, heartbreaking accounts of their daily suffering, pleas to God for help, descriptions of punishments and pain. They found hundreds of toys still in their original packaging, bought by the parents but never given to the children, as if David and Louise wanted to maintain the appearance of being good parents without actually providing for their children's needs. They found evidence that the abuse had been going on for decades, that the family had lived in multiple states, that no one had ever intervened despite numerous opportunities. The question that haunted investigators was simple: how did this happen? How did 13 children suffer for so long without anyone noticing? The answer is uncomfortable. The Turpin children fell through every crack in the system designed to protect them. They were homeschooled so no teachers saw them. They rarely left the house so no neighbors knew them. They had no friends, no extended family contact, no connection to the outside world. When the family did appear in public, the children were coached to smile and behave normally. The few times concerned individuals did report suspicions to authorities, the reports were not followed up adequately. In one instance, a child welfare check was conducted, but the parents were given advance notice, allowing them to stage the home and coach the children. The investigator saw nothing alarming and closed the case. This is the systemic failure at the heart of the Turpin case. It was not one person's mistake. It was a collective failure of institutions, communities, and individuals to look closely enough, to ask hard questions, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. Would you have reported your suspicions if you were a neighbor? Or would you have told yourself it was not your business? The trial of David and Louise Turpin was swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence, both parents pleaded guilty to multiple counts of torture, false imprisonment, child abuse, and dependent adult abuse. In February 2019, they were each sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. During the sentencing hearing, some of the Turpin children gave victim impact statements. Their words were devastating. They spoke of years of pain, of hunger so severe they would steal food and hide it, of watching their siblings suffer and being unable to help, of believing they deserved the abuse because their parents told them they were bad children. But they also spoke of hope. They spoke of their dreams for the future, of wanting to go to college, to have careers, to build normal lives. They spoke of their love for each other, the bond between siblings who had survived hell together. And they spoke of Jordan, the sister who saved them, who risked everything so they could be free. Jordan Turpin herself has become an advocate for abuse survivors. In interviews, she has spoken about the difficulty of adjusting to normal life, of learning basic skills that most people take for granted, of processing trauma that most people cannot imagine. She has also spoken about the ongoing challenges her siblings face, the ways that years of abuse have left permanent scars, both physical and psychological. Some of the siblings have thrived in their new lives. Others continue to struggle. All of them are still healing. The aftermath of the Turpin case raised difficult questions about the foster care system and adult protective services. After their rescue, the Turpin children were placed in various group homes and foster situations. Some of these placements were inadequate. Reports emerged of continued abuse, neglect, and exploitation in the very system designed to protect them. Several of the adult siblings have spoken publicly about feeling abandoned by the state, about being given minimal support to transition to independent living, about struggling with poverty and homelessness despite the public attention their case received. This secondary trauma, the failure of the system to adequately care for the Turpin children after their rescue, is perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire case. These children survived decades of torture only to find that freedom came with its own set of challenges, that the world they had been taught to fear was not as welcoming as they had hoped, that survival was only the beginning of a much longer journey toward healing. The psychological impact of long-term captivity and abuse is profound and often permanent. Experts who have worked with the Turpin children describe symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, developmental delays, attachment disorders, and learned helplessness. Many of the children struggle with basic decision-making because they were never allowed to make choices. They struggle with trust because the people who should have protected them were the ones who hurt them. They struggle with identity because they were never allowed to develop a sense of self separate from their parents' control. Recovery from this level of trauma is not linear. It is not simple. It requires years of therapy, support, patience, and resources. Some of the Turpin children will heal more fully than others. Some will carry the scars of their childhood for the rest of their lives. All of them will have to navigate a world that is fundamentally different from the one they were raised to believe existed. The Turpin case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family privacy, parental rights, and the limits of intervention. In American society, we place enormous value on the sanctity of the family unit, on the right of parents to raise their children as they see fit, on the privacy of the home. These values are important. They protect families from government overreach and preserve cultural and religious diversity. But they also create spaces where abuse can flourish unchecked, where children can suffer in silence, where the most vulnerable members of society have no voice and no protection. How do we balance these competing values? How do we protect children without infringing on legitimate parental authority? How do we identify abuse without creating a surveillance state? These are not easy questions, and the Turpin case does not provide easy answers. But it does provide a stark reminder of what can happen when we prioritize privacy over protection. When we assume the best about families behind closed doors, when we fail to listen to the quiet signs of suffering. The house on Muir Woods Road in Paris, California still stands. It has been sold to new owners who have no connection to the Turpin family. The neighborhood has returned to its quiet suburban routine. But the memory of what happened there lingers, a reminder that horror does not always announce itself with screams and violence. Sometimes it hides behind closed curtains and locked doors. Sometimes it wears the mask of a normal family. Sometimes it goes unnoticed for decades until one brave person decides that silence is no longer an option. Jordan Turpin made that decision. At 17 years old, malnourished and terrified, she climbed out of a window and changed the course of 13 lives. She did not know if she would succeed. She did not know if anyone would believe her. She did not know if the world outside was really better than the world inside. But she took that chance anyway, and in doing so, she proved that even in the darkest circumstances, even after years of systematic destruction, the human spirit can still find the strength to fight for freedom. The Turpin case is not just a story about abuse. It is a story about survival. It is a story about the bonds between siblings who protected each other in the only ways they could. It is a story about the failure of systems and the resilience of individuals. It is a story about the long, difficult road from captivity to freedom, from trauma to healing, from silence to voice. But perhaps most importantly, it is a story about choice. David and Louise Turpin chose to torture their children. Neighbors chose not to ask questions. Systems chose not to investigate thoroughly. And Jordan Turpin chose to escape. Every person in this story made choices, and those choices had consequences that rippled outward, affecting lives in ways both terrible and redemptive. The question the Turpin case leaves us with is not whether such horror can happen again. It can. It will. There are children suffering right now in homes that look normal from the outside, in families that seem functional to casual observers, in situations that no one is investigating because no one knows to look. The question is whether we will choose to see them, whether we will choose to act, whether we will choose to believe that our responsibility to protect the vulnerable outweighs our discomfort with intervention. Jordan Turpin chose to act. She chose to believe that freedom was worth the risk. She chose to trust that someone would listen. And because of that choice, 12 other people got a chance at life, at healing, at becoming something more than victims of their parents' cruelty. What would you choose if you saw something that did not seem quite right? Would you report it, knowing you might be wrong? Would you ask questions, knowing you might be intrusive? Would you trust your instincts, knowing you might face pushback? Or would you look away, tell yourself it is not your business, assume that someone else will handle it? The Turpin children did not have anyone who chose to see them until it was almost too late. They did not have anyone who chose to ask hard questions or trust their instincts or push past the facade of normalcy. They had only each other, and eventually, they had Jordan, who decided that one more day of torture was one day too many. That decision, made by a 17-year-old girl with a child's mind and a survivor's heart, is the reason we know the name Turpin at all. It is the reason those children are alive. It is the reason we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that monsters do not always look like monsters, that abuse does not always leave visible scars, that the worst crimes can happen in plain sight, if we choose not to see them. The Turpin case will be studied for years to come by psychologists, criminologists, social workers, and legal experts. It will be analyzed for what it reveals about family dynamics, coercive control, institutional failure, and trauma recovery. But beyond the academic analysis, beyond the true crime fascination, beyond the headlines and documentaries, there are 13 real people who lived through something most of us cannot imagine and who are still living with the consequences every single day. They are not characters in a story. They are not case studies. They are human beings who deserved better from their parents, from their community, from the systems designed to protect them. They deserve to be seen. They deserve to be heard. They deserve to be saved long before Jordan had to save them herself. And now, as they build new lives in a world they were taught to fear, They deserve our support, our compassion, and our commitment to ensuring that what happened to them never happens to another child. They deserve a society that chooses to see, to act, to protect. They deserve a world where no child has to plan their escape for 2 years before finding the courage to climb out a window and beg for help. Jordan Turpin gave her siblings that chance. The question is whether we will give it to the children still waiting, still suffering, still hoping that someone will choose to see them before it is too late.